My friends, I want to begin today with a small, ordinary moment that took place in my own kitchen not long after I turned 72, a moment I would have dismissed entirely a decade earlier, but that stopped me completely at the time. I was washing a single teacup, an ordinary task I had performed thousands of times across my life without a second thought, and I found myself suddenly, unexpectedly moved nearly to tears by the simple sight of morning light passing through the water running over my hands. Nothing had happened. No news, no memory, no obvious trigger. Just an ordinary teacup, ordinary light, and an entirely unexpected wave of feeling that seemed to arrive from nowhere in particular. I want to be honest with you that I did not know, in that moment, what to make of this experience. I mentioned it, somewhat sheepishly, to my own doctor during a routine visit, half expecting her to reassure me this was simply an unremarkable, perhaps slightly concerning quirk of aging. Instead, she smiled and told me she had heard some version of this same experience from countless patients in their 70s, describing it not as anything to worry about, but as one of several quiet, largely unremarked upon changes that seem to arrive during this particular decade of life, changes that, taken individually, seem almost too small to matter, but that, considered together, point towards something genuinely significant happening beneath the surface of an aging mind and heart. I began paying closer attention after that conversation, both to my own experience and to the experiences my friends and fellow parishioners quietly described whenever the subject arose. I want to share with you today 10 of these silent changes, changes so quiet and so easily dismissed that most of us never think to mention them to anyone, changes that, once named and examined honestly, reveal themselves as something considerably deeper than mere quirks of an aging body. This is not a lesson about anything you need to actively practice or change. It is simply an invitation to notice, and perhaps understand a little more clearly, changes that may already be quietly unfolding within your own 70s, whether you have consciously registered them yet or not. The first silent change, needing less sleep, yet somehow feeling more rested. I want to begin with a change I noticed gradually rather than all at once, a genuine reduction in the number of hours I required each night to feel adequately rested, paired, somewhat paradoxically, with a sense of feeling more genuinely rested than I often had during my busier, younger decades when I slept considerably longer. I recall mentioning this to an old friend, a retired nurse, who told me this pattern is genuinely common among people our age, not necessarily a sign of declining health, as I had initially feared, but often simply a reflection of a body and mind carrying less accumulated daily stress than they once did during the busier decades of raising children and building careers. I have come to believe this particular change reflects something considerably deeper than simple physiology. A mind less burdened by anxious, unresolved daily stress requires less sleep to process and recover from that stress in the first place. My own reduced sleep, once I examined it honestly alongside this insight, seemed to correlate quite directly with the genuine reduction in daily anxiety I had also noticed accompanying my 70s more broadly, a decade in which many of the responsibilities and worries of my younger years had genuinely, finally begun to ease. I want to note, too, that this change often arrives paired with a genuine shift in when we naturally wake, considerably earlier than during our working years, often before the sun itself has fully risen. Rather than fighting this shift, as I initially tried to do out of some old habit of associating early rising with either duty or insomnia, I eventually learned to welcome these quiet early hours as some of the most genuinely peaceful of my entire day, a gift of unhurried stillness that my younger, busier self would never have recognized as anything other than an inconvenience. The second silent change, crying more easily at small, unexpected moments. The second change, the very one I described in my own kitchen, is a genuine increase in emotional sensitivity to small, ordinary moments, beautiful light, a piece of music, a kind gesture from a stranger, moments that might have passed entirely unnoticed during my busier, younger decades but that now arrive with a genuine, sometimes overwhelming emotional weight. I discovered, speaking with several friends about this same pattern, that this particular change is remarkably common, though rarely discussed openly, perhaps because many of us were raised in a generation that considered visible emotion, especially in men, something to be carefully managed rather than openly expressed. I have come to believe this heightened sensitivity reflects a genuine softening of the emotional defenses many of us built up across decades of busy, demanding adult life, defenses that allowed us to function efficiently through countless daily obligations but that also, necessarily, dulled our access to the full emotional richness of ordinary moments. As these decades of intense obligation finally ease, the defenses built to manage them seem to ease as well, revealing an emotional responsiveness that, rather than representing any genuine decline, may actually represent a return to a more fully feeling, more genuinely present way of experiencing an ordinary day. I recall a particular conversation with a retired colleague of mine, a man who had spent his entire career in a demanding, high-pressure profession that required considerable emotional restraint, who confided that he now found himself moved to tears by things as simple as a grandchild's handwritten note or an old photograph discovered while cleaning out a closet. He told me he initially found this new sensitivity embarrassing, a departure from the composed, unflappable persona he had maintained for decades. He eventually came to see it instead as something closer to relief, a long overdue permission to simply feel what he had always quietly felt, without the professional armor that had once required him to keep these feelings so carefully contained. The third silent change, losing patience for small talk and superficial conversation. The third change I have noticed, both in myself and in numerous friends my age, is a genuine, growing impatience with small talk and superficial social conversation, a pattern several of us initially worried reflected a kind of unwelcome crankiness or social withdrawal, until we recognized, examining it more honestly together, that it actually reflected something closer to a heightened, more urgent desire for genuine, substantive connection. During the years we understand, more clearly than ever before, are genuinely limited. I have come to believe this particular impatience reflects an increasingly clear-eyed awareness of time's genuine scarcity at this stage of life, an awareness that makes the empty currency of purely superficial conversation feel considerably less worthwhile than it once did during younger decades when time felt, whether accurately or not, considerably more abundant. This change need not make us rude or dismissive toward others. It simply seems to redirect our own genuine energy and interest toward conversations that matter, an entirely understandable shift once time itself begins to feel genuinely precious rather than simply assumed. I noticed this shift most clearly at a community gathering roughly a year into my 70s, standing through what would once have felt like an entirely ordinary conversation about the weather and local traffic, and feeling, quite unexpectedly, a genuine restlessness I would never have registered so clearly during my younger decades. I did not respond by becoming rude or withdrawn. I simply found myself, with increasing regularity, gently steering conversations toward more substantive territory, asking a genuine question about someone's actual life rather than continuing along the well-worn grooves of purely surface pleasantries, and discovering, to my genuine satisfaction, that most people seemed just as relieved as I was to finally have permission to speak of something that actually mattered. The fourth silent change, craving genuine solitude even among people you love. The fourth change, one that initially confused and even worried me somewhat, is a genuine, growing need for periods of solitude, even during gatherings with family and friends I love deeply, a need to occasionally step away from even pleasant company simply to sit quietly with my own thoughts for a while. I recall mentioning this to my own daughter, worried it might reflect some genuine withdrawal from the family relationships that mattered most to me, only to have her reassure me that she had noticed the same pattern beginning in her own mother, my late wife, during her own 70s as well. I have come to believe this particular craving reflects a genuine, healthy need for periodic mental rest and integration, a body and mind that, having absorbed considerably more life experience across 7 full decades, seems to genuinely require more frequent periods of quiet processing than it once did during younger years when experience accumulated more slowly and required less ongoing digestion. This need for solitude, properly understood, does not reflect diminished love for the people we step away from periodically. It simply reflects a genuine, physiological need that, once honored rather than resisted, actually allows us to return to those same relationships considerably more present and genuinely engaged. I remember, in particular, a large family reunion during my early 70s when I found myself slipping quietly out to the back porch for perhaps 20 minutes, simply sitting alone with my own thoughts amid an otherwise wonderfully full, noisy house of people I love dearly. I worried, at first, that a family member might notice my absence and interpret it as some sign of unhappiness or withdrawal. Instead, my own daughter found me there, sat beside me quietly for a few minutes without any need for conversation, and eventually said, gently, that she understood completely, since she had noticed her own mother doing exactly the same thing during her final years. This small moment of recognition, rather than any explanation I might have offered myself, did more to ease my own guilt about this particular need than any reasoning I could have provided on my own. The fifth silent change, a growing, persistent awareness of legacy and what remains behind the fifth change, one many of my friends have described to me with a mixture of discomfort and genuine curiosity, is a persistent, growing awareness of legacy, a recurring set of thoughts about what will genuinely remain of our lives once we are gone, what our grandchildren might someday remember about us, what small wisdom or example we might manage to leave behind that outlasts our own physical presence. I recall this particular awareness arriving gradually rather than suddenly, growing considerably more persistent throughout my own 70s than it had ever been during my 60s or earlier decades. I have come to believe this particular awareness reflects a genuine, healthy psychological development rather than any morbid preoccupation, a mind naturally, appropriately turning its attention toward questions of meaning and continuity as our own remaining years grow genuinely fewer than the years already lived. This awareness, properly understood, need not produce anxiety or dread. It can instead produce a genuine, clarifying motivation to be more intentional about the relationships, the words, and the small daily examples we offer to the people who will carry some portion of our influence forward long after we ourselves are gone. This particular awareness eventually led me to begin writing down small memories and reflections for my grandchildren. Nothing elaborate, simply a page here and there capturing a memory or a piece of hard-won wisdom I wanted them to have access to someday. I did not begin this practice out of any dramatic sense of urgency, but simply because this quiet, persistent awareness of legacy finally found a concrete, satisfying outlet, transforming what might otherwise have remained a somewhat abstract preoccupation into something genuinely productive and meaningful. The sixth silent change, a genuine softening of the need to win or be right. The sixth change, one I discussed at length in an earlier reflection about arguing, but that deserves mention again within this broader pattern, is a genuine, gradual softening of the old need to win arguments or be recognized as correct, a need that had governed considerable portions of my earlier adult decades, but that seems to loosen its grip quite noticeably throughout the 70s specifically. I have observed this same softening in numerous friends my age, several of whom describe themselves, in their younger decades, as considerably more argumentative and combative than they now recognize themselves to be. I have come to believe this particular softening reflects a genuine, hard-won accumulation of perspective, a recognition, earned through many decades of lived experience, of just how rarely any single argument's outcome actually matters in the larger, longer view of an entire lifetime. This perspective, difficult to access during younger decades still caught up in the immediate urgency of daily disputes, seems to arrive more naturally and more consistently once 7 full decades of lived experience have accumulated behind it. The seventh silent change, noticing beauty in ordinary things with unusual intensity. The seventh change, closely related to the emotional sensitivity I described earlier, is a genuine, heightened capacity to notice and appreciate beauty in entirely ordinary things, a sunset seen countless times before that suddenly stops us in our tracks, a familiar piece of music that produces a depth of feeling it never quite produced during younger decades, an ordinary meal shared with family that carries a weight of appreciation considerably beyond its actual, modest content. I have come to believe this particular heightened noticing reflects a mind and heart no longer distracted by the countless competing demands of career building and active parenting, finally able to give ordinary beauty the full, undivided attention it always deserved but that busier decades rarely permitted. This change, once recognized and welcomed rather than dismissed as simple sentimentality, can become one of the more genuinely rewarding aspects of this particular decade of life, an unexpected gift arriving precisely because so many of the earlier decades' distractions have finally, naturally quieted. The eighth silent change, dreaming more frequently and vividly about the distant past. The eighth change, one several friends and I have compared notes on with genuine curiosity, is a noticeable increase in vivid dreams specifically about our own distant past, childhood homes, long-departed parents, friends and experiences from many decades earlier that rarely if ever appeared in our dreams during busier, middle-aged decades. I recall being genuinely startled by the vividness and frequency of these particular dreams once they began appearing with some regularity throughout my own 70s. I have come to believe this particular pattern reflects a mind naturally engaged in a genuine process of life review and integration, revisiting and, in its own way, making peace with the fuller arc of an entire lifetime now that this arc has grown considerably longer and more complete than it was during earlier decades, still primarily focused on an unfolding present and future. This process, whatever its precise psychological mechanism, seems to offer a genuine, if largely unconscious, opportunity to integrate and find meaning in experiences that, during busier decades, was simply lived through without the luxury of this kind of reflective processing. A close friend of mine described waking, on several occasions, from dreams so vivid and detailed about her own childhood home that she found herself briefly disoriented upon waking, momentarily uncertain which decade she was actually living in. Rather than finding this disorienting experience troubling, she eventually came to welcome it, describing these dreams as a kind of gentle visitation from her own earlier self, a reminder of the full, continuous thread connecting the child she once was to the woman she had since become. The ninth silent change, a genuine, growing freedom from others' opinions. The ninth change, one I discussed at length in an earlier reflection regarding validation, is a genuine, deepening freedom from anxious concern about others' opinions and judgments, a freedom that seems to grow considerably more complete and more stable throughout the 70s than it ever managed to become during earlier decades of active striving and comparison. I have watched this particular freedom deepen in numerous friends my age, several of whom describe themselves as considerably more concerned with appearances and reputation during their own 60s than they now find themselves to be. I have come to believe this particular freedom reflects the natural, cumulative result of countless lived experiences gradually demonstrating, again and again, just how little most external opinions actually matter to our genuine, lasting well-being across an entire lifetime. This lesson, difficult to fully absorb during younger decades still testing and calibrating their own place in the world, seems to finally settle more completely once 7 decades of accumulated evidence have had sufficient time to make their genuine case. The 10th silent change, experiencing time itself differently, both faster and slower. The 10th and final change I want to describe is perhaps the most difficult to articulate clearly, a genuine shift in how time itself feels, years passing with a speed that startles me considerably, while individual, present moments, a quiet morning, a conversation with a grandchild, seem to stretch and deepen with a richness that time never quite offered during busier decades. I recall discussing this particular paradox with several friends, all of whom recognized this same strange, dual experience of time simultaneously accelerating across the broader arc of years while somehow also slowing down and deepening within individual, present moments. I have come to believe this particular paradox reflects the genuine convergence of several changes I have already described, a heightened appreciation for ordinary moments combined with an increasingly clear awareness of time's genuine scarcity across the broader remaining arc of life. Together, these two forces seem to produce this strange, dual experience, years accelerating while moments deepen, a genuinely unique relationship with time that, once recognized and understood, can be welcomed as one of the more distinctive and, in its own way, genuinely rewarding features of this particular decade of life. My friends, I want to be honest with you that I do not believe every single one of these 10 changes will arrive identically, or in precisely the same form, for every person reading this reflection today. Each of our own particular 70s unfolds according to our own unique circumstances, health, temperament, and life history. But I have come to believe, through my own experience and through countless conversations with friends navigating the same remarkable decade, that these 10 changes, or some genuine variation of them, arrive with sufficient consistency to suggest something considerably deeper than mere coincidence, a genuine, natural unfolding of the human mind and heart as it moves through this particular, remarkable stage of life. I think often of that ordinary teacup, and the entirely unexpected wave of feeling it produced in me that quiet morning. I understand now, considerably more clearly than I did in that initial, confused moment, that this experience was not some concerning anomaly requiring worried explanation, but simply one small, silent signal among the 10 I have described to you today, evidence of a mind and heart genuinely, naturally deepening in ways that younger decades, however full and busy, had never quite allowed. I want to share one further thought before we close. I believe part of why these 10 changes so often go unmentioned and unexamined is that many of us were raised in a generation that treated aging primarily as a story of loss and decline, a narrative that leaves little room for genuinely positive, deepening changes to be named or celebrated. I hope, in naming these 10 changes plainly today, to offer a small corrective to this narrower story, one that makes space for the genuine possibility that this particular decade, whatever physical challenges it may also bring, carries within it real, distinctive gifts of its own, gifts that deserve to be spoken about openly rather than quietly dismissed or, worse, mistaken for something concerning. If you are watching this today and you recognize even a few of these 10 silent changes beginning to unfold in your own 70s, I want you to know that these changes, rather than representing anything to fear or resist, may well represent some of the genuine, distinctive gifts available specifically within this particular decade of life, gifts that arrive quietly, without any fanfare, simply waiting to be noticed and welcomed by anyone patient enough to pay them the honest attention they genuinely deserve. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared helps you recognize and welcome your own particular version of these 10 silent changes, and offers you a considerably deeper appreciation for this remarkable, often underappreciated decade of life. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Notice the quiet, unremarked shifts unfolding within your own heart and mind, and trust that these shifts, silent as they are, very often mean something considerably deeper than we have ever been taught to recognize. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay attentive, stay open, and remember, the quietest changes are very often the ones that matter most. Thank you for watching.